In a dim archive under glass, there is a schoolroom map of Eurasia so large it looks less like geography than an accusation. Across Siberia, across the steppe, across deserts, river basins, caravan routes and mountain walls, one old word is printed with impossible confidence: Tartary. Not a village, not a province, a continental label, the kind of word modern maps do not allow. Then the eye moves forward in time and the word begins to fracture. Cities change spellings, regions split, familiar names vanish. In one registry after another, whole clusters of settlements seem to become something else at once. A place can survive in stone, in rail alignments, in river landings, in cemetery records, and still disappear from the map. The accepted explanation arrives quickly. Historians will say Tartary was never a single nation in the modern sense, only a broad European catch-all for the peoples and territories east of Muscovy and north of China. As knowledge improved, the old term fell away. Then came imperial administration, modern surveying, standard spelling systems, revolutions, border changes, census reforms, ideological campaigns, the normal violence of state naming. Cities were renamed because governments do that. Old labels died because they were imprecise. The timeline is clean, the paperwork is vast. On the surface, nothing mysterious is required, and yet the clean version leaves a residue. If Tartary was merely a vague mistake, why did it persist across serious atlases, diplomatic documents, trade descriptions, military maps, missionary reports, gazetteers, and encyclopedias for centuries? Why do so many settlements across the former Russian and Inner Asian world seem to pass through sudden episodes of reclassification, transliteration, or renaming that make earlier records appear unrelated to later ones? Why do local names, imperial names, sacred names, postal names, railway names, and cadastral names so often describe the same place under different identities? The official explanation answers the broad question. It does not always answer the practical one. How exactly does a civilization become unreadable to its own descendants? There is a more serious possibility, and it does not require fantasy. The theory is not that one secret committee erased an empire overnight. It is that a vast older geography, loosely gathered under the name Tartary, was gradually broken into legible administrative pieces, then renamed, translated, ranked, merged, and republished, until the original pattern became almost impossible to see. What people now call Tartaria may be a distorted memory of that older pattern. Not a single hidden superstate, perhaps, but a real layer of civilizational continuity that later regimes had every incentive to simplify, nationalize, and forget. What changed was the explanation. Start with the maps themselves. Early modern cartographers were often wrong in detail and strangely accurate in scale. They did not draw Tartary because they were hallucinating. They used the term because they were naming an enormous, imperfectly known zone with enough internal continuity to deserve a label. The borders shift from atlas to atlas, but the habit repeats. Western mapmakers, working from travelers' reports, diplomatic summaries, Jesuit correspondence, and inherited classical frameworks, kept writing the word for a reason. Not because they knew nothing, but because they knew there was something there that did not fit their ordinary categories. A name that large is not a proof, but it is evidence of a persistent perception. The pattern does not disappear. Then look at the records beneath the maps. Imperial gazetteers, church lists, tax rolls, military surveys, postal directories and resettlement files show the same location wearing multiple names at once. One version in Russian, one in a local Turkic language, another in Mongolian, Persian, German, or a phonetic Latin rendering made by a foreign surveyor. A river crossing can be named after a saint in one register, a tribal group in another, and a railway station in a third. When later researchers compare only the official modern name to a single older map, the place seems to have vanished. Often it did not vanish. It was translated, standardized, or subordinated to a district center. The archive did not go dark. It became fragmented. The famous number matters here because it captures the scale of that fragmentation. Researchers point to lists in which more than 1,000 settlements appear under revised names on a single publication date, as though an entire landscape had been processed at once. Whether every case was a true renaming, a formal standardization, or a bureaucratic consolidation almost misses the point. To the public record, the effect is the same. Hundreds of older identities are severed from easy recognition at once. A village known locally for centuries can reappear as a Soviet commemorative name, a transliterated administrative term, or a numbered workers' settlement. The place remains, The historical memory attached to the place weakens immediately. The mainstream explanation deserves to be stated fairly because much of it is true. States rename places after revolutions. Empires impose official spellings. Surveyors standardize what merchants, priests, and local inhabitants once called different things. The Soviet renaming campaigns were real. So were decolonizing renamings, decommunization laws, ethnic reversions, and border-driven spelling reforms. No hidden empire is required to explain why Petrograd became Leningrad or why countless villages were stripped of religious or aristocratic names. But what this explanation fails to address is the cumulative loss created when renaming overlaps with transliteration, reclassification, demographic replacement, and archival separation. Each step seems ordinary. Together, they can erase continuity without ever burning a file. Engineering records make the problem sharper. In many places across the steppe and forest belt, the oldest durable infrastructure does not line up neatly with the official story told by later names. Rail spurs terminate at settlements, whose current labels are younger than the embankments that serve them. Masonry culverts outlast the administrative units that once justified their construction. Survey benchmarks remain stamped with obsolete district names. River ports preserve warehouse alignments older than the surrounding official town identity. None of this proves a lost empire, but it does show how naming can become detached from material continuity. Stone, brick, and steel hold one chronology. The registry holds another. The stone remembers. Old photographs do the same thing in a quieter way. A glass plate image might be catalogued under a modern city name, even when the church in the frame belonged to a different parish jurisdiction. The street was later renamed, and the photographer labelled the location according to a now vanished province. Mountain Pass appears in expedition records under one term, on military maps under another, and in Soviet geological surveys under a third. When those databases are digitized without crosswalks, the past becomes difficult to search. It looks thinner than it was, not because the evidence is missing, but because the names no longer touch. The record is still there. At some point the scale widens and the same logic begins to repeat far beyond any one disputed region. Crim Tartar place names were replaced after deportations. Chinese and indigenous names in the Russian Far East were systematically altered. Central Asian cities cycled through Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet forms. Across Eastern Europe, thousands of settlements shed ideological names after the fall of communism. Colonial maps elsewhere in the world did the same work under different flags, flattening multilingual landscapes into cleaner imperial vocabularies. This is what matters. The mechanism is not unique, the mechanism is normal. Once you see it, the disappearance of an older civilizational layer no longer looks impossible. It looks administrative. That is why the Tartaria question refuses to die. The word survives because it names a gap between what older documents imply and what modern categories permit. Official history says the term was broad and imprecise. Fair enough, but broad does not mean empty. Imprecise does not mean imaginary. A catch-all can still refer to something real. Networks of trade, common building practices, shared routes, overlapping populations, frontier institutions, tax regimes, military corridors, religious chains, and inherited settlement logic spread across an immense landmass. Later nation-states prefer sharper lines. They need provinces, ethnic majorities, rail jurisdictions, census tables, legal definitions, development zones. A civilizational blur is hard to govern, so it becomes many smaller stories. This is also where the theory becomes less dramatic and more unsettling. The truth may not have been hidden by a theatrical conspiracy at all. It may have been buried by clerks, committees, map editors, ministries, wartime priorities, library catalogue systems, and the economic need to make territory manageable. Classification can erase as effectively as censorship. A renamed city is cheaper to administer than a layered one. A standardized atlas is easier to print than a multilingual landscape. A development plan wants fixed units, not historical ambiguity. Bureaucracy rarely thinks of itself as an author of amnesia, yet again and again, that is exactly what it becomes. There is another clue in the legal language of place itself. Modern states classify settlements by rank: city, town, village, workers' settlement, urban-type settlement, district centre, closed city, special zone. These are not neutral descriptions. They decide what counts, what gets funding, what appears on maps, what disappears into a subordinate line. When a place is demoted, merged, annexed, or sealed for military reasons, It's public identity contracts. In some cases, entire inhabited lands survive behind generic labels. In others, the historical core becomes a neighborhood inside a newer administrative shell. The older name does not always die. It becomes unofficial. That is often enough. So when someone says 1,213 cities were renamed on a single day to hide Tartaria, the phrase is too blunt to be literally trusted and too suggestive to be casually dismissed. The number dramatizes a real process. It points to the moment when scattered renamings stop looking local and start resembling an operating system. Not one decree against one empire, but a pattern in which old geographies are translated into modern obedience. The public sees a map refreshed. The archive sees continuity broken into pieces small enough to ignore. What remains is a landscape where the names are newer than the memory beneath them. And that is why the argument cannot be settled by ridicule. The weak version of the Tartaria theory is easy to mock. It imagines a perfectly unified hidden empire, a universal cover-up, a clean villain. The stronger version is harder to dismiss because it asks a narrower and more historical question. How much of Eurasia's older continuity was made illegible by the combined force of imperial language, revolutionary renaming, technical standardization, and administrative convenience? How many places now appear disconnected simply because the chain of names has been broken in too many archives for an ordinary reader to follow? Those are not irrational questions. They are archival questions. The final discomfort is simple. A civilization does not have to be physically destroyed to be lost. It only has to be renamed often enough, translated badly enough, and filed under enough separate headings that no one sees the whole shape anymore. Then later, when a surviving map shows a forbidden word spread across half a continent, the modern eye assumes the old cartographer must have been confused. Maybe he was. But maybe confusion entered later, when the landscape was forced into cleaner terms. The map kept the larger memory, the state kept the smaller names.